Well, good morning to everyone. Thank you to Poland for this invitation. It's really important for us to have this opportunity to present our work and to communicate on this important task that is EMF and health. I guess this is really one of the key questions in this task, how to communicate what we are doing in order for the population not to become so aware and let us do our work the best we can. As Christina mentioned, this session will be on EMF, health, research, and future needs. We were supposed to have here Emily van de Werchter, but she would not be able, and so next, at the end of the presentation, you will have time to go outside and see the video. Now here with us, there is Zenon Sienkiewicz. I hope it was okay. He's a member of ICNIRP, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, since 2011, and he will speak about the work in progress related to the values. The speech will be on Long and Winding Road, update of the ICNIRP draft HF guidelines. So you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Oh, that's nice and loud. Right, good morning. Yes, good morning, everybody. As you heard, my name is Zenon Sienkiewicz. I'm from ICNIRP. I also work at Public Health England in the UK. Slower? Oh, so we've only got 15 minutes. So, okay. As always, I speak too fast. Right, so thank the organisers for inviting me here today. Thank you for the introduction. And what we're going to do today is talk about the ICNIRP draft guidelines. You can see there, they're HF, or high frequency. In other parlance, they are radio frequencies. So we're talking anywhere from 100 kilohertz up to 300 gigahertz. And as I said, I begin with apology, because ICNIRP started revising these back in 2012. And it has been a rather long and winding road. We've had a lot of false starts. We've had a lot of dead ends. But we think we are now homing in on the final straight. Perhaps we're on the last circuit. And hopefully we should be presenting a draft guideline next year at the BEMS conference in May. At that time, we will be inviting comments. But equally, if you hear anything today you like, do tell us. If you hear anything you don't like, write to the IEEE. So that's what we're going to say. And it really is a work in progress. These are only draft values. Everything I'll say can change, possibly will do. And I would really ask you, if you want to take a photograph of me or the slides, please don't cite them or quote them outside the room. Again, because it just wouldn't be appropriate. Now, what am I going to talk about today? Well, as I said, we're talking about limiting exposures between 100 kilohertz and 300 gigahertz. We set a guideline in 1998, which went everywhere from zero, from static fields, right up to 300 gigahertz. In 2010, we actually had a guideline which actually went up to 100 kilohertz. So now we're actually trying to update the guidelines, which have been in existence now for far too long. What we want to do is provide realistic guidelines under realistic exposures. And we want to also consider all sorts of exposures in terms of occupational and for workers. Again, what we do consider are direct effects, which is direct effects on the biology, as well as indirect effects as far as we talk about contact with charged objects. What we don't consider, and we won't consider, are electromagnetic interference, exposures for medical purposes, or even compliance issues. As we've seen in the previous presentations, there are protocols, there are handbooks. People know much better than ICNIRP exactly what you need to do. So for compliance issues, how to do things, we just won't tell you. Wait, we're not. Now, how are we going to do this? Let's come back. Goodness. How do we do it? Well, first of all, we have to try and to establish what are the effects of exposure. Which is easier said than done. As we heard, there are probably 250,000 articles out there, scientific ones at least, looking at what the effects are over the years, from when we first had radar onwards. What we then have to decide is what are averse to humans, and then actually to say, well, what are the real effects in terms of being substantiated? This is a term that ICNIRP is now using to try and understand that an effect may be reported, it may appear in a high-quality journal, but it doesn't actually always make a lot of sense what they're saying. So what we want to do is use effects which are, or have been, or can be, replicated. So you in your laboratory can do it, you in your laboratory can actually find it. We also want to look at the quality of the studies. There's a lot of stuff out there which is complete and utter trash. I have to say this. It really upsets me. And also, are the results sort of explicable scientifically? Do they make sense with the rest of the other physics and biology that's out there? And when we see a study which actually has those sort of points, we actually consider them substantiated. And that does start to rule out a lot of the effects which you may find. Then the next thing we want to do is try to identify the threshold at which these effects occur. And if there is a criticism of my colleagues who actually work in this field, is we tend to not to look at sort of dose-response functions. We tend to use a single exposure and report the effect, which doesn't really tell us when the effect starts to kick in or how it changes with increasing exposure. What we need to do there is to try and identify the minimum exposure that produces some identifiable harm. Again, it's obvious, but it's worth actually saying. And where we may have insufficient research, what we would like to do is actually to say, can we have what we termed an operational health effect threshold, which is the sort of minimum exposure period predicted to cause harm, which comes from not the high-frequency radiofrequency literature. And again, as you'll see in a minute, that is very important for the terms of radiofrequency exposures. Now, the way ICNIRP has actually always sort of derived its guidelines is that it has a basic biological restriction, which is termed a basic restriction, and then it uses a sort of an external field value called a reference level. And what we tend to do is that we find for the basic restriction, we have to identify what the threshold is, then we have to apply what we term a reduction factor, could be a safety factor, to actually to account for differences between people, for uncertainties, for knowns, unknowns, and other sorts of things, and again, most crucially, for variation across the population. We're not just talking about workers, we are talking about children, we're not just talking about healthy people, we're talking about people who have diseases, we're also concerned with difference, as I said, in age, with health status. So again, we must somehow capture that. So we try to find a reduction factor, and we are fairly conservative, which actually is based on these parameters. If we are losing a health effect which seems particularly nasty, we may use a larger reduction factor. If we're doing something which is largely perceptual, we may actually have a smaller reduction factor. But we'd almost like to have consistency across our guidelines. So I said we have guidelines from 2010, 1998, and now for well, hopefully next year. And again, we would like to present some sort of reasoned or rationale for having these reduction factors. Now, we actually said that for both general public and for workers. We will find that reduction factors are higher for the occupational people, for workers, than they are for general public, simply because we feel that the general public may not be aware of their exposures, they might not have training in mitigation, and again, there may be greater sensitivity in the population. As I said, whether you're pregnant, whether you're young, or whether you're old, are likely to make you slightly more sensitive, and indeed other disease states. Then what do we have to do? Well, we have to calculate the reference levels based upon these basic restrictions. Now, these are external field values, and they do provide a practical method, as it says here, for determining compliance. Again, this is simply, I would say simply, these are sort of treated, no, these are derived, I think, sort of mathematically more than they are biologically. And again, they should be conservative for all realistic exposure conditions, but again, they may not encounter all possible exposure conditions. In other words, we're doing a realistic estimation here. Well, what is the scientific rationale we have for all this? Well, unfortunately, Emily's not talking about this today, I think, but there is a WHO environmental health criterion on RF fields, which is currently being drafted. Again, this has been worked on for the last few years. And this actually looks at a very extensive body of literature. It actually looks at molecular, it looks at cellular responses, and it also looks at human epidemiology. So it is actually looking at all the relevant literature, and it is done in a fairly systematic review. And what we can say from that review, at least the draft that's available, is there is no evidence that exposure causes cancer, or indeed any other disease. Cancer is one of those diseases which actually has captured the imagination in this field. And as you may be aware, there was a study released last year from the National Toxicology Programme looking at effects in rodents. And again, I've even highlighted it there, that the available evidence from that study doesn't change the view that exposure causes cancer. Again, I think the press sometimes have actually latched upon this, and they've rather over-egged what the results say. But we wait for full publication, which hopefully will be sometime next year. So what evidence do we have of harm? Well, unfortunately, curiously, we have still the effects of elevated temperature. We knew this very early on, and we still know that. There is this phenomenon of microwave hearing, this hissing and popping sound that you can sometimes hear with pulse fields. We know at the lower end of the RF frequencies, you can have actually stimulation of nerves and muscles. And also you can have at very high fields electroporation. So there, as far as we're concerned, are the four interaction mechanisms that we have to deal with. Now I'm going to sort of take those almost in reversed order and do the last of those three first, because we don't think we're actually going to base guidelines on them. Although we have talked about guidelines, we've always talked about microwave hearing in our guidelines before, we now actually feel that having a hissing or popping sound actually does require very, very quiet conditions to hear it. And it is clearly a very localized thermal effect. As far as we can tell, it is the fields are absorbed by tissues close to or in the inner ear, and this sets up a pressure wave, which is interpreted by the brain as actually being a sound. So again, you hear this hissing, clicking, popping noise. But we don't consider it is harmful. So we're not going to have any specific restrictions based upon the avoidance of that noise. For electrostimulation or for nerve and muscle stimulation, they've already been described in our earlier guidelines from 2010. So we're not going to consider those further here. So the electrostimulation is considered in 2010 only. And electroporation is real. Intense electric field pulses can cause these changes in plasma membranes in cells. I mean, it clearly can be used in therapies. But is it a problem in practice? And as far as we can tell from the literature we can see, it isn't likely to happen. So we don't think we need restrictions on those. So already of the four mechanisms we've got, three we're not considering further. So that leads us just with the increasing temperature. Now, clearly, body core temperature, as it's marked here, BCT as well, is used to indicate health effects. If you're going to get hot, you're going to have a problem. But again, getting hot, right, working in hot environments, is actually considered on many other factors. How hard you're working, what clothes you're wearing, and what the ambient temperature is to actually control your personal temperature. And that's something ICNIRP cannot regulate or actually give any guidelines on. Now, what we do know is that the body core temperature is about 37 degrees, give or take. And it varies by about a degree over a day, plus or minus half a degree in normal sort of healthy adults. Now, we all have these really good thermoregulatory mechanisms to actually keep us at this temperature. We can pump blood through our skin, which radiates to the environment. We can sweat. We can take our clothing off. We can seek a cooler environment. So we are very, very good at maintaining sort of a thermo-normal temperature. Now, what we do know is that health effects are induced when you actually start to get warm, you become hypothermic at around 38 degrees or more. But generally, as long as you're taking less than a degree, they aren't long-term effects. All of us, I'm sure, have actually done worked in the garden or run upstairs. We can get slightly warm, and then we may sweat a bit, and there's not a long-term hazard. But what we do think is a degree, an elevation in body core temperature by more than 1 degree is potentially harmful. And this is what we actually want to try and avoid. And again, ACGIH, the government hygienists from the States, have actually looked at heat stress at work. And they actually conclude the same thing, that for workers in particular, a 1 degree rise in core temperature is to be avoided. So again, here we are using information from outside the sort of RF domain. There is sort of limited evidence, the human studies where people get warm by RF, and there is some theoretical modeling, which again is used to determine what the whole body average specific energy absorption rate would be. And again, that's the stage to work out the guideline. But also people, they're not just exposed on the whole body, especially with 5G, we should say. We're looking at local temperatures because you're going to get lots more local absorption. So the other thing we have to look at is what does the effects of local absorption of radiation? Well, again, you get a local absorption, a local increase in temperature. What we do know there, if you start to damage cells, if you go over 41 or above, so again, we're looking at to try and keep temperatures below these values. Again, in the brain and in the body core, you're talking about a 37 degree as a normal temperature, but in the sort of skin and the external ears, the temperature is much lower, around 35 to 36 degrees. So what we're actually thinking, what are the temperatures to be avoided? Well, clearly, we do not want the brain to go over about 39 degrees. That's getting very, very warm. And probably the rest of the body about 40 degrees C. Now, many years ago, I did an experiment when I was young and handsome, where I put people's hands in hot water. And we actually tried to look at what was the maximum temperature you could find in the hand, and then work out what the power absorption would be. And we actually found that you could get about 20 watts per kilogram through the hand and wrist, and that was the equivalent to a temperature of 40 degrees. And again, it's using information like that which has helped to inform these guidelines today. So what we are trying to do is avoid temperature increases of about 2 degrees in the head and the torso and about 4 degrees in the limbs. So again, these are our sort of operational limits. And again, we use extrapolation, theoretical modeling to actually determine what these local SARs will be in terms of watts per kilogram. So this is the slide. And I would say, please do realize that is our work in progress. And again, this is a fairly complicated slide. Hopefully, some of you at least can read what the values are. And this, if you like, are our basic draft restrictions, and really what I'd like to talk about today. And you can see on the top line that we have a body core temperature rise, a whole body average SAR of around 4 watts per kilogram is considered as our health effect. So we're actually thinking somewhere about 4 degree rise. Now that's fairly conservative. There are studies suggesting it could be anywhere between 6, maybe even 7. But again, given the uncertainties and the limitation in our data, we feel more confident in actually having a value of around 4 watts per kilogram as our sort of health threshold, which is equivalent to a 1 degree rise in core temperature. As you'll see there, we're looking at something of a 30-minute exposure time. In the past, we may have looked at 6 minutes, but we think 30 minutes is far more realistic. So with a reduction factor for workers of 10 and a reduction factor of 50, so it's 5 times larger than the workers, we have a whole body average SAR of 0.4 and 0.08. So literally no change there from 98. In other words, I think we did the guideline right then, and using the limited increase in information, this is our answer here. If we look at local temperatures in the head and torso and the limbs, and again up to 6 gigahertz, for the head, we're trying to protect a 2 degree rise, which can be anywhere from about 16 to 20 watts per kilogram. Again, we're looking at the values and we still have some uncertainty, so we're homing in on that. But we're looking at an average time of about 6 minutes. Again, we feel that that's a better value to use than the 30 minutes. But we are, for the head and the torso, we're trying to avoid a 2 degree rise in temperature, whereas in the limbs, where they're less critical, it's of tissues, it's also at a colder value, where we're trying to avoid an increase of 4 degrees. That could be produced by anywhere from 32 and 40 watts per kilogram. And again, averaged over 6 minutes. So again, using reduction factors of 2 for workers and 10 for the general public, we find that for the SARs in the head and torso, we'd have somewhere between 8 and 10 watts per kilogram for workers, and again, 1.6 to 2. Again, these are rather precise, and I'm sure we will get to a single value in due course. And again, if we're looking at the SAR and the limbs, we're talking anywhere between 16 and 20 for workers, and again, a factor of 5 lower than that, of about 3 to 4 for members of the public. And again, that gives you a feel for the sort of the basis of the guidance. But as you can see, the local limits stop at 6 gigahertz. So we're actually thinking that around 6 to 300 gigahertz, we actually look at the penetrating power density. Again, we're still trying to limit this at 4 degrees over the body. And again, we actually end up with around 100 watts per square meter with a reduction factor of 2, if we assume 200 watts per meter actually causes this 2 degree rise. And again, a factor of 10 takes us down to 20 watts per square meter. What the other thing, again, if we're looking at the pulsed fields, as I said, we're not limiting this now on avoiding the auditory effect, but we are actually going to base it still on heating. As you can see on the second and third line from the bottom, again, we actually have a split at 600 gigahertz. So we're looking at both instances trying to limit exposures to about 4 degrees. Now that is sort of internally consistent with the rest of this document. So again, always we're looking at as an operational health effect, a rise in temperature. And again, we have a fairly complicated system there to actually say what the value would be. And you have a T and a quarter to work out exactly what it is. And again, this is still under discussions. And finally, we do realize that contact currents are real, they do happen. But we couldn't decide whether a contact current should be a basic restriction or a reference level, so he's come up with a compromise at the moment, at least, and we're calling what's called a guidance level. We're just telling people that these things can happen. So between 100 kilohertz and 110 megahertz, we try and avoid pain, as you can see there. And so we're actually saying you should probably limit exposure below 20 milliamps for workers and 10 milliamps for the general public. And again, that in essence is our sort of guidelines. So again, please don't cite or quote. But what about the reference levels? Well, again, I'm not even going to attempt to start those today. There are many issues that still need to be resolved. We are aware that there are conditions where, based upon whole body average, you can exceed the basic restrictions if you're small stature people in some sort of strange posture. Again, people have pointed this out to us in the past. And we're also aware that based on whole body average, you may call violations on the local basic restrictions. So again, we need to resolve that and find a method for doing that. Averaging time, I said currently it's 6 minutes, more or less. Now we're looking at a whole body average of 30 minutes and a local SAR average of about 6 minutes. But what do we do for local pulse fields? It's somewhere maybe up to 10 seconds, but again, we're trying to work on that. And again, hopefully we'll have results soon. As I said, we should have a draft for public consultation ready by the summer of next year after the BENS conference. So really, I have to say thank you for your attention and more for your continued patience.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, Mr. Sienkiewicz. Two issues. First of all, the average. We had a problem with 10 gram and 1 gram. 10 gram in Europe, 1 gram in America regarding the SAR. So it was a problem, and it is solved now. IEEE 2005, they go again to 10 gram. But FCC Part 2, it is again 1 gram. Now, you have another problem. You will start with the 6 minutes and you will go to 10 seconds. Very bad. We need one time, one reference. And if you change it, it will be a problem. So this is an observation. Now a question. In the 100 kilohertz, you arrive to 83 volts per meter, and in the ICNIRP 1998, it is 87. So you confused us. In the 2010, the 100 kilohertz, it is written in the guidelines that it is till 10 megahertz. But in the title, it is till 100 kilohertz. Now you start with HF. First of all, some countries, HF is 2 mega to 30 mega. In the radio regulation, is 3 mega to 30 mega. So if you have now new guidelines, we are confused. What will you do with the 2010? It will not be there. It will be 1998 for above 30 mega. You will have the 2010 for 100 kilo, and you will have the HF that you don't know if it is from 2 mega to 30 mega or 3 mega to 30 mega. I hope that I didn't confuse you. Thank you, Mr. Chechen.
I couldn't put it better myself. Thank you. Oh, you want an answer? Well, clearly, what other organizations do is out of the remit of ICNIRP. We have guidelines which go from 0 to 100 kilohertz, and now from 100 kilohertz up to 300 gigahertz. They are the guidelines. So within the first section, one guideline applies. With the second section, the other guideline applies. We are looking back to the 2010 guideline simply because we don't have to repeat what we said already, and we wouldn't alter what we said. So again, yeah, I understand that you want international harmonization, but again, I think we have to look at the problem and derive the answers that we feel best. And these at the moment are our ideas that we feel best. It may cause confusion in some circles, and for that we apologize. But certainly I can take this message back and we can consider what we're doing. Well, I think 30 minutes and 6 minutes has more biological sort of face validity than other values. So at the moment, the biology is pointing us in this direction. So, I mean, standards and harmonization is interesting and important, but I think the biology is more important to actually get the biology right, because everything rests upon the basic restrictions. is okay. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for. I'm very comfortable with the speed, so it was your tone is so good that I got focused. But let me ask about the uncertainty issues that you raised there regarding the reduction factor that it would cover. But what I would like to see also, what we would like to see at compliance assessment part is what does that uncertainty cover, at least of clear type of uncertainties, because we have had the communication with you, with IEEE. So now, could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, really, it is due to age, it is due to size, it is due to health status. And they are the uncertainties. In many instances, we don't have any data to tell us what they would be, and we have to use ideas from other areas to try and to capture that. But because we don't know how big they are, it's very difficult. This is why our reduction factors tend to be, orders of magnitude.
So big, yeah.
So we have to try and capture all this. And for me, the uncertainty comes around the fact that you've got other factors that affect your heat load. And we just can't tell you what clothes you need to wear, what drinks you need to take, do you turn the air conditioning up? We just can't do that. So we have to try and think of almost a worst case and then make sure that exposure from our guidelines doesn't impact upon you.
I understand that. What about measurement uncertainties?
Sorry, what?
Measurement uncertainties. When you...
Sure, they're there as well.
Okay, that's what I wanted to...
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a biologist. I don't do these measurements.
Thank you. There is another question.
Thank you. That was a really good presentation.
Thank you.
If I could just pick, I had a different question, but could I just clarify, when you talked about uncertainties, are you suggesting that, that the reduction factors you talked about, they take into account measurement uncertainty, or they don't?
They do. They should try and capture all the uncertainties wherever they come from.
Okay. Now that's a good clarification, because we also in the compliance testing standards we look at uncertainty for assessment, but it's always good to know that it's taken into account. The question I had relates back to the public communications, and I'm very encouraged that it is strictly on the biology and the science base, because that underpins the public confidence. We will have to explain, in addition to you guys, we will have to explain what the guidelines are and their basis, because many people will come to us and ask. Will you have a simple explanation that accompanies the guidelines? Will you have some sort of version of what you've done, but in simple layman's terms that many of us here could use? Because that would be something I think, well, I would like anyway.
It's something I would like as well. I'd like to see something on our website, the ICNIRP website, which I think people could see and they could use and download. And I think it's something that I will take back to the Commission and say, this august body suggested such a thing. I think it's always beholden, I think, on ICNIRP to actually do good risk communication. And it's possibly something we haven't done as good as we could do before. I think we can address ministers and governments, and we do a fantastic job. But I think where we come to talk to members of the public, I think sometimes we do not treat them with the sort of respect they deserve or with the amount of information that they may have, but we mustn't treat them like idiots. So I think we need a tailored program to tell people exactly why we're doing it and where we get the values from. But at the moment, I don't think we have plans to do that, but it's certainly something we should consider.
Well, if that's an outcome of this workshop and you could take that back, that would be an excellent outcome.
No, certainly, yes.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other question? Yes, here in the front, Christina. Oh, it's okay.
Thank you. Good morning.
Hello.
So I have actually one question related more, as you may know, there is an EMF scientist appeal that was signed by over 225 scientists, actually, asking WHO and other UN agencies specifically to act on policies for 5G small cells antennas. I just wanted to know what is the ICNIRP position on this issue, and also on specifically what's the work that is being done also to address the concerns that have been raised by this scientist.
Well, generally, ICNIRP does not talk about different applications. We talk about frequencies. So therefore, whether it's 5G, 4G shouldn't really matter to us, as long as we would just cover the whole spectrum. So I think that's probably a cop-out, but I think that's true. If other people have a different opinion to us, there's nothing we can do to alter that. We can communicate our knowledge, we can put ourselves, we can go to conferences, but again, everyone's entitled to their own opinions. And if they wish to influence WHO or try to influence WHO, that's really up to WHO to listen, to hear what the voices are telling them, and who has the authority and who has the knowledge. Okay.
Thomas Pamela, Mobile and Wireless Forum. Thank you for your presentation. I actually would like to pick up on almost a side remark you made about the NTP study, because there is a lot of discussion going on whether this study is so valuable as it seemed to be or was thought to be, and I think it all comes down whether this study was fully blinded or not. And I wonder whether you had any further information, because when I looked up the report from May 2016, I myself found a quote from Dr. Lauer, who asked the question, or who stated actually that the way it was put, it was not fully blinded. And I just wondered whether you had more information on that.
Well, this is a question, I think, which is very, very important. And we had a presentation from one of the authors. ICNIRP had a private presentation, which I think as people know about. And it was clearly stated there were sort of 3 rounds of the sort of pathology assessment. And the first 2 were not blind. It was only the final one was, when they've actually subselected and subselected and subselected, that the final pathologists didn't know what the exposure status was. So in that respect, it clearly wasn't blind. I have so many concerns with the studies, though. One, it sort of ran over budget dramatically, so I don't think anyone in this room is going to offer us $25 million to do another study. It took, what, I don't know, 10, 15 years to complete, which is much longer than the purported 5 years. So again, I don't think anyone is going to actually spend the next 15 years of their life trying to repeat it. And I think the fact that we've only got 2 tumor types out of an unknown number of tumors in, I don't know, what, male rats and not mice, so we haven't reported. It was put on a website. The internal review was 6 referees, one of which said this shouldn't be published, but it still went ahead. We're promising that the full report will be available, I think, next spring, which is fantastic, including the mice data. But at the moment, we're sort of living in limbo. That there seems to be a political decision to put this report out there. And I myself have been anticipating this now for about 10 years and really hoping and praying that whatever result it gave, it will be clear-cut and really useful. Either saying, no, there's no animal data, or yes, there is some animal data, just an exposure to RF causes cancer. And we got the worst of both worlds. Now, we always do this in EMF work. We talk about the Hen House project, which was meant to set up about, sort of VDU fields. And we didn't get a clear-cut answer. Over coffee, I was mentioned, there is another study from the States which found almost the same result in, I think, 85, which is looking at sort of RF fields, where they actually found it was a decrease in tumor numbers in the control group, which actually produced the effect. And it's exactly what we found in the NTP effect, that we've got a handful of tumors in the exposed group and a 0 number of tumors in the control. Historically, we'd expect 1 or 2 tumors in the control group, which means there's no statistical difference between them. But we didn't find that. We had a very, very healthy control group. Now, I can't explain that. And the fact that they saved animal lives is laudable. They saved money, which is necessity, but they only had 1 exposed group. So we don't know whether this one control group they used was actually very healthy. If only they'd done it again in this 10 years, this 15 years, this £25 million, they could have found an extra $10,000, I'm sure, or so, to have actually given me a second control group. Then at least I'd know, is this control group really healthy, or have the animals changed? Has there been some genetic drift in the animals that their sort of base rates of cancer are now much lower than they were? All in all, it's a mishmash, and it's so annoying. You know, when I read the report, I just cried. I'm there at my desk crying. I'm thinking, this is the answer. Give me an answer, one way or the other. I mean, as a researcher, I want them to be cancers in animals. My goodness, I can go to my government and say, chaps, we need the money. And the money flows in my lab. Or equivalently, I can say, there's no need to worry. Spend the money on obesity. Spend the money on sugar in drinks. You know, spend the money on making people healthy exercise. Even spend the money stopping people from using mobile phones when they're driving because we're killing people doing that. We could spend the money appropriately, but what do? We get this answer where we don't know, and you get the piece around going higher and higher as I get more emotional, and people are getting, they just don't know the answer. So in short, no, I don't think it's a very good study. I don't know where it's going, and I'm really upset that it ended up with this I know, unknown result. But I don't know if that was your question, but it gave me the opportunity to rent. That'll do, yeah. Thank you.
Well, if we've recorded that, if you could post that on YouTube, that would be an excellent outcome. Just a question. On your slide, you said that the guidelines took into account the results of the NTP study. I think the results to date. So my only clarifying question is, you said that the full paper won't be, and I appreciate your comments on it, won't be published till next year. But in setting your guidelines, have you seen all of the results?
No, we haven't. But what we have, we understand that more results are coming. We will wait to see what they are. But we cannot wait and wait and wait. This road is long, it is winding. Yeah. And I think many of us will be retired before we even finish these set of guidelines. So I think we need to move on. Okay. But I think many in the Commission, myself included, do have serious concerns about the results and what they tell us. And when we add those results, even if they're positive, with a number of animal studies which have been shown to be negative, now when others have looked at the data, you probably end up with about 6 studies which actually seem to show a field-dependent effect. Micropetrology study is one, but equally there are 2 studies where looking at the emu PIM1 mouse, looking at increase in lymphoma, where in fact it didn't replicate twice. So even in the half-dozen studies, there are studies which directly oppose what we find. Now, if we do a weight of balance idea, the NTP study is important, but it doesn't shift the weight of balance over in one favour or the other. So we've taken it on board insofar as we're able to, and at the moment, that's as far as we can go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, there is another question. Yeah.
Well, actually not a question, just a comment on the question that was raised about the 5G appeal, because I wanted to mention that the European Commission answered to the 5G appeal. It was sent to the Commission, and they actually said, we stick with the recommendation from 1999, because this is our precautionary approach which we adopt, and I thought it might be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
A question regarding the ICNIRP 1998. Can we say in Israel that these are the guidelines of ICNIRP, or we have to tell them for different, let's speak about above 10 mega, which is the most important for broadcasting and cellular and so on. Can we say that ICNIRP 1998 is there and will not be changed in the following 5 years?
Yes and no. They are there. They are the existing guidelines for the frequency range 100 kilohertz up to 300 gigahertz. But we are in the process of revising them now. So for now, that is the guideline that we recommend. But as we said, hopefully by this time next year, we will have a new guideline.
When will you finish above 30 mega, above 8? When will you finish the guidelines?
How long is a bit of string? Well, we will present them next year, as I said, at the BEMS conference. We will then have a 3-month period for consultation, and then we'll probably have a couple of months where we review what the comments were, incorporate them as necessary and make the changes, and then produce the guideline. So probably about this time next year, I think we'll have a guideline ready. Is that okay?
Okay, yes, we have still another question, yes.
Earlier in October, I think the chair of ICNIRP presented at the GSMA workshop, and there was discussion around the referencing the WHO's EHC. Now, I appreciate we haven't seen the presentation. Are you still able to reference the EHC? Is there can you give any indication of what might happen there?
Well, there is a draft that was put out for public consultation, so that is certainly what we will use. I do know, since I'm part of the process, that we are updating the EHC as we speak to include studies up until the end of this year. Then I think, and again, hopefully I can say this, that I think that will be published as like a technical memo beyond a systematic review. So I think in due course, and perhaps within a year, we will have a fully referenced manuscript available on all the different endpoints. But at the moment, I think ICNIRP are actually going to be using the draft. We, of course, we're in our own day jobs, we're always looking at other papers, be the NTP or anything else. So again, if anything new came along, which you thought had substantial impact, I think we could deliver it into the guidelines. So again, we are aware of new studies, but I think it is the draft version that we'll be using.
Okay, I see there is any more comments or questions. If not, I would like to thank Zenon for his availability.